Hey, I am going to show you a couple games I played this week. I played on Wednesday in Fitchburg at the Wachusett Chess Club against Paul Godin. His rating is 1947, and he had the white pieces. He played knight f3, knight f6, c4, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castle, castle. And you see this sometimes in d4 and c4 openings, white and black just kind of developing their entire king sides before doing anything else. And I think because white has placed his pawn on c4, this is considered some kind of English. I played d5, challenging white in the center immediately, and hoping, because I was playing against an opponent I outrate, to be able to play for an advantage immediately by destroying what exists of white's center and then establishing a center of my own. Hopefully that gives me more space than him. C takes d5, knight takes d5, knight c3, attacking the knight, and I played c5. And again, I want to establish central pawns that can give me more space than white has. And I don't really have to worry about knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and then a revealed attack on the queen, because this knight on f3 currently has nowhere good to go. He played queen b3 instead, which looks normal to me. And here I think I was the one to take us out of book. But I have no idea what the theory is in this opening. I think black plays a move like knight c7. And I don't know why. I guess just to keep the pieces on the board when he has more space, or... yeah, I'm not really sure. Maybe he's just planning to stick this bishop on e6 and harass the queen on b3, and he wants the knight out of the way first, so that there are no trades on that square. But for whatever reason, black players sometimes play knight c7. I chose a different path. I took on c3, understanding that I was letting him take back with his d-pawn, establishing a symmetrical pawn structure, with both players having pawns on every file except the d-file. Okay, not a symmetrical pawn structure quite, because white's pawn is on c3, and I have one on c5, so black has a little bit more space. But my idea was that I was going to stick my queen on c7, and that from this square, the queen protects all of the potentially weak black pawns. Additionally, the natural bishop f4, hitting the queen on c7 and making life uncomfortable for black, I thought I could respond to with the move e5. Taking more space in the center with tempo. I think over the course of the game, maybe including on this move, where are we? Including on this move, the computer likes the idea of bishop f4. Obviously it understands that black is going to play e5 and threaten the bishop, but the computer just wants to move the bishop away at that point, and eventually, I think, take advantage of weak squares on d5 and d6. But Paul played bishop to e3 instead, putting some pressure on the e5 pawn, and white's pieces look kind of nice here. The two bishops are cutting across the center of the board and putting a lot of pressure on black's queen side. And the queen is supporting them from b3. The rooks are already connected, and the knight is reasonable, whereas black has two undeveloped minor pieces and therefore disconnected rooks. But I kind of had the feeling as we were playing this game that I was going to have time to catch up in development. I played knight d7, and that has something to do with the fact that the queen on c7 is such a good defender. I was planning on putting my rook on b8 and eventually playing b6 and maybe bishop b7 as a way of unwinding, and expecting to end up in some kind of equal-ish endgame with a somewhat symmetrical pawn structure, in which I was hoping to maneuver around and somehow outplay my opponent. Paul played rook a to d1, which looks good to me. Why not put the rook on this open file? I played rook b8, getting my queenside rook off of the a8 square, providing more protection for b7, and potentially creating a problem for the white queen on b3 at some point. Paul played knight g5, and I think this was probably a mistake, because where is this knight going from here? If it goes to the e4 square, it looks kind of uncomfortable there, and it doesn't do very much. Black's planning to play b6 anyway, so the extra pressure on c5 is not really a big deal. and the knight can't go to d6 or f6. And on e4, it's just kind of blocking this bishop on g2. And if it goes back to f3, then why did it go to g5? And so the only real point of knight g5 is that after I play h6, which I did, white sacrifices on f7, with the idea that the light squares on the a2, g8 diagonal are very weak. Rook takes f7, and now white would try this move, bishop to d5. Yet at first it looks really intimidating. It just kind of looks like black's going to lose this rook and be down material. But my plan after knight takes f7 was either to play c4 immediately, cutting off the queen's protection of the knight, and I was expecting that he'd play knight takes h6 check, but then I could play bishop takes h6, and he can't grab this bishop on, can't grab this bishop on h6 because he has to do something about the fact that his queen's under attack. And he can't move his queen to any square from which it defends e3, so I can even double his pawns on the e-file if I want to. I thought this would be good for me. Hang on a sec. Now that I look at this, the white queen can go to c2 and be immediately attacking the g6 square. So perhaps this is not a reasonable way for black to go. Okay, but that was one of my defensive ideas. The other one was that after rook takes f7, bishop d5, I would play c4 again anyway, and if queen takes c4, then I get to trade queens, which makes it so that it's not as big a deal that my king is more exposed than the white one. And I was thinking there might be some problem involving bishop takes a7, but I thought maybe rook a8, and maybe I'd be able to take this a2 pawn. That's not really the case here if I have to scare away the bishop on c4. But that bishop is going to have to trade itself for the rook on f7 so that white is not down material. Right? 2, 3, 4. Yeah, because I have a piece for 2 pawns at this point. So after c4, I imagined that white would play bishop takes c4, and then my idea was to go knight e5, hitting this bishop on c4 and protecting the rook on f7, and I expected bishop takes f7, knight takes f7. I didn't really know how to evaluate this during the game because I couldn't see it very clearly, but I kind of thought that 2 minor pieces for a rook in general is decent for the minor pieces. And here, unfortunately, white has 2 pawns and can even grab a third one, so now that I look at this, it doesn't look so hot for black. But I thought that if knight takes f7, the combination of the possibility of c4 immediately and of c4 after bishop d5 would mean that black would end up with an advantage here. But Paul did not play knight takes f7, he played knight e4, and that kind of makes knight g5 a mistake, I think. b6, so now the c-pawn is solid, and I'm ready to play bishop b7 and get another piece into the game, and then the rooks will be connected, and maybe I can challenge white on the d-file. Queen to c2. Alright, here again, I don't totally understand the move. I think Paul was getting out of the way of c4 coming with tempo. I don't know, it just doesn't seem like a very big deal. He was also getting his queen off of the b-file, where my rook is, and preparing to put pressure on a different light square diagonal toward the black king side. But what this does is it takes the queen off of the a2, g8 diagonal, freeing the f-pawn, and because of that I was soon able to move it. Queen c2, king h7. I want to play f5 and e5 at some point, ending up with much more space than white. But my king is going to need some protection when that happens, as is the g6 pawn. So why not put the king on a safer square and defend a weak pawn? Paul played h4, and here it comes, f5. And this is a particularly good time for f5 because the knight on e4 doesn't have any good squares to go to. In fact, it only has the d2 square. Knight d2, so white's pieces are kind of in each other's way right now. The knight's not on a very good square. The rook on d1 can't do anything on the d-file as long as the knight is sitting there. And there's some possibility that black will play e5 and f4, winning this bishop on e3. Knight f6. White was kind of threatening to play h5 and undermine the light-squared part of black's kingside pawn structure. So knight f6 guards the h5 square and the g4 square, just kind of solidifies black's kingside, gets this piece better developed, opens up the light-squared bishop. Knight f3. Paul is eyeing the e5 square, and doing that for an important reason. If I now play e5, expanding in the center, which looks safe because the knight attacks it and the queen defends it, white has the move knight takes e5. And after queen takes e5, there's an unfortunate skewer along the h2 b8 diagonal. Worse than that, the queen can't move to any square from which it defends the rook. So white's bishop is going to grab an entire rook and not be captured in exchange. So I played knight g4, harassing the bishop on e3, and making it so that there are now 3 pieces defending e5, which is plenty to get in that move. Bishop c1 from white, and normally you don't want your bishop on its starting square, but it's usually because, well, for one, it's less active, and that's true here too, I guess. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's a rook on a1, and that rook is blocked by the bishop on c1. But Paul has already put his rook on d1, so now it's a little bit better idea to have the bishop on c1. e5. All right, and I've kind of gotten by now the position I wanted to have. The black pawn structure gains for black much more space than the white structure does for white. And if things continue that way, if black keeps gaining space and improving his pieces, and if white's pieces keep kind of getting kicked back or shuffled around, eventually black will have a significant advantage. Knight h2 from Paul, looking to trade off these pieces. But now that I have significantly more space, trading minor pieces is not something I want to do. It just helps white reduce his disadvantage. So I played knight f6. Paul played c4, and now his idea is to play b3, I guess, and bishop b2, put some pressure on e5, and get ready to trade this dark-squared bishop for one of these minors. f4. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about this move other than that if I want to try to break open the white king side, I have to make contact with the white king side pawn structure, and f4 is the way to do that. Additionally, I'm freeing the f5 square for my light squared bishop, which, upon getting to that square, will force the white queen to move away. That's important for my king, as he currently is on the same diagonal as that queen. b3 from Paul. Bishop f5, queen b2, rook bd8. And I think by this point, after the game, Paul and I thought maybe this wasn't the best move, but I'm not sure we came up with anything black should have done instead. And either before or after this move, I think black's advantage is pretty significant. He has a lot more space and better pieces. In fact, all of the pieces are pretty good. These bishops are excellent, and interestingly, they're now doing what the white bishops were doing at the beginning of the game. The white bishops were raking across the center and black's queenside, and now the black bishops are controlling the center and white's queenside. Black's knight is much better than white's. Black's rooks are better than white's. The d-file rooks are the same, but of course the rook on f8 is superior to the rook on f1, and the queens are about the same. So black should be much better here, when that's added to the fact that black has more space. h5 from Paul, an interesting move, and one I think I responded to pretty badly. I think what I should do is just play g5 here, because it looks really solid, and kind of say, okay, this light squared bishop is doing a good job defending the king. White's not close to being able to trade that bishop off. And with this black pawn structure in place, the white knight is not going to be able to land on any square from which it can harass harass the bishop on f5. But instead I took on h5 with my g-pawn, kind of missing white's idea. And that was to play knight f3, and now to head over to h4, and then to trade the knight for the bishop on f5, making the black king very weak on the b1 h7 diagonal. And here I think black's advantage is starting to fall apart. So this was probably a mistake on my part. I played rook takes d1 though, and after rook takes d1, rook d8, with the idea that if white trades on d8, it's not possible, unless he puts something on the d2 square, to guard d1. And that could cause some, of course, tactical problems for white. After I played rook d8, Paul played rook e1, a passive move, but he wanted to avoid putting my queen on the d file, I guess. I took on g3, f takes g3, and e4. Okay, and this is... I didn't really feel good about this move, and it's because white has this natural reply bishop f4 hitting my queen. I'm not sure what I should have done instead. Maybe just get this knight out of the way and then play e4, if you can follow me, at a time when bishop f4 can be responded to with queen takes f4, g takes f4, bishop takes b2, something like that. Or maybe the queen would take on g7 with check in between. But that might be superior to the way I did things. I just played e4 right away, and after bishop f4, had to move my queen out of the way, queen d7. And white has this natural move, knight h4. I'm saying natural a lot, aren't I? To get the knight out of the way, so it's no longer attacked by the e4 pawn, and to hit this bishop on f5. And black's kind of feeling uneasy now, because the king is getting less and less safe. Part of his pawn cover has disappeared, and one important defensive piece is about to leave the board. I played knight g4, because it's a revealed attack on the white queen. So I attacked the white queen, but the problem is that after Paul plays his move, queen b1, I'm not really sure what my knight is doing on the g4 square. I can play bishop d4 check, but white's just going to play the move e3. And then what? Then I have to move this bishop away again, and then I will lose this bishop on f5, followed by losing the pawn on e4, which will cost me the game. Why don't I show that? Bishop to d4 check, e3. I move my bishop away somewhere, knight takes f5, grabs a piece, but if I take that piece back, bishop takes e4, pins the black queen to the black king. So queen b1, and I thought, oh geez, so my e4 pawn turns out to need more defense, and so I put my knight back on f6. Not a particularly impressive sequence of moves. Knight takes f5 from Paul, queen takes f5. Okay, and white has made strides toward equality or even having a better position, because he now has the two bishops for a bishop and knight with a pretty open board. At least the part of the board that's relevant is open, and that's the center and the king side. And though he's down a pawn, black's extra pawn is a doubled isolated rook pawn. It's not doing anything. So I think white's probably equal here or close to it, but it's still a fight. Black still has more space thanks to this e4 pawn, and both kings are vulnerable, so either player could end up with a game-winning attack. Rook f1 from Paul. I played queen g4, getting the queen off of this file and attacking this e2 pawn. Bishop to e5 from Paul. Okay, and now the two players are kind of going at each other's throats, and somebody's going to break through and get at the other guy's king. Paul gave me his pawn on e2, but what he wanted to do is take on f6. I took back with the bishop because I don't have any better move. I was thinking during the game about playing rook to d2, but the problem with this move, I mean, there's probably more than one problem, but white can just play queen takes e4. And after the king moves, assuming there's not a better move for white, he can at least trade on e2 and trade on g7 and be up a bishop. But white doesn't want to make the mistake of playing rook takes f6 instead, because then black has rook d1 check, winning the queen on b1. So Paul took on f6 with the bishop, I took back with my bishop, and again here white can't really take on f6 because rook d1 check simplifies into a winning endgame for black. Paul played bishop takes e4 check. I guess, was it here? Where was it? No. yeah, okay, back in this position, after queen g4, white has a way to acquire a modest advantage and go into an endgame, sort of. You can play bishop takes e4 check, which gives the two bishops up, but after queen takes e4, the material count is equal, but white's pawns are obviously better than black's. And I think this would, if Paul is looking for an improvement, this is definitely it. His bishop e5 allows me to grab that pawn on e2. And now bishop takes e4, and now it's the case that if Paul trades on e4, after bishop e4, king g7, the king is able to get out a check and protect the bishop on f6. And black is up a pawn. It's not a significant pawn, and there are bishops of opposite color. This is probably going to result in a draw. Instead of a reasonable advantage for white, which was the case when he had a pawn on e2. So Paul played bishop takes e4, a more ambitious move. King g7 again gets the king out of danger and protects the bishop on f6. Bishop d5 blocks the rook on d7, which was threatening to invade and cause serious problems in combination with the black queen. Rook f8, and this has a not exactly subtle threat to play bishop d4 check, followed by something takes on f1, winning a rook. Paul played king h1, the move I was expecting during the game, and for a while I had a hard time finding a way to continue here for black, but eventually found queen g4. The idea now is to take on g3 or to play queen h3 check, either of which can cause problems for white. And Paul, unfortunately, blundered here with queen e1, allowing queen h3 check, king g1, bishop d4 check, and all of the material is going to fall on f2. What should he have played instead here? He still had this interesting move, queen f5, and this is kind of tricky because he's offering a queen trade. If black accepts it, then this endgame should probably result in a draw. And it looks like white is trying to trick black into taking this pawn on g3 so that the queen can be pinned to the king along the g file. But the problem here is that black has this move queen takes g1 check, and after king takes g1, bishop d4 check, and then some king move and rook takes f5, and black's up a rook and two pawns. So that doesn't save things for white after queen takes g3, but what seems to is the move queen takes h5, covering the h-file so that a check from the queen will result in a trade of queens at least, and just keeping pieces on the board that might allow white to develop enough counterplay against the black king to at least have perpetual check. In fact, I think the computer here recommends queen h4 with a trade of queens. But Paul played queen e1, and that allows queen h3, king g1, bishop d4, and he resigned here. White's only move is rook f2, and then black can either take here immediately, winning the queen, or can throw in the move queen takes g3 check first, which probably leads back to the same position and the winning of all of white's stuff. Alrighty, and then on Thursday, I played against Donna at the Worcester Club. She's at least she was for a long time, the tournament director at the Worcester Club, and now I think she just sort of runs the club, but there are two other people doing the tournament directing. I had the white pieces, and Donna's rating is 1743. I played d4, she played d5, c4, c6, knight f3, e6. So now we have a triangle set up for black. I played knight c3, which kind of invites what's known as the note boom variation with d takes c4. Probably not going to go into that now. But she played knight f6, and now we have what's known as a semi-Slav. It's a Slav if this black pawn is back on e7, and black tries to get his bishop out before doing anything with that e-pawn. But it becomes a semi-Slav as soon as this bishop gets trapped behind the e-pawn. e3, bishop d6, bishop d3. I tend to err on the side of getting my king castled as quickly as I can in these openings. I consider it such a valuable move that I don't see why not play it as soon as possible. The main alternative to doing the things this way, I think, for white is to develop the dark squared bishop before playing e3. And though I don't know much about this opening theory, I imagine that that makes the position a little bit more dangerous, because white is putting more pressure on black with a bishop from f4 or g5. But the dark squares on his queen side are weaker because of that bishop's absence, and the white king takes an extra move to get castled. e3, bishop d6, bishop d3, and h6. Okay, I don't totally understand this h6 move. I think maybe Donna was looking ahead to white playing e4, which is pretty natural, followed by developing the bishop and maybe getting ready for that in advance. Yeah, I don't think that was the right idea, though. I would probably just have developed this knight to d7 with black, or castled kingside. Donna played h6, castle kingside, and knight bd7. And going back here a sec, actually, now that I think about it, as soon as white plays bishop d3 in these openings, black has the option to play d takes c4. He can castle first if he wants, and white will castle, but now, or in a move or two, black can play d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and b5, expanding on the queen side with tempo. And this leads to a position that I'm sure is very well known theoretically, but not to me. And yeah, I've played a position like this several times. I think it's interesting, and that's probably what black should do here instead of playing h6. Okay, castle kingside, knight bd7, b3. So I see white as having two options here. One is to play e4, a very aggressive central pawn break, with the idea that he's going to be putting a ton of pressure on d5 and threatening the move e5, forking black's minor pieces, which will probably force black to make some kind of capture with his d-pawn. And after that happens, white's center gives him significantly more space than black's gives black. And black can even take on e4 and then play knight f6, trading a pair of minor pieces and then putting her other knight on f6 with tempo. But after some move like bishop c2, white retains an advantage. Although during the game I didn't understand why. I thought that black here might play the move c5, or maybe a couple moves earlier, and I didn't really understand why this would lead to an edge for white. As it turns out, the computer finds kind of a crazy way to put black in a bind here. D takes c, well, this is not crazy. D takes c5, bishop takes c5, and now this move bishop a4 check. Black plays bishop d7, blocking the check, and now this really strange move b4, whose purpose is to distract black's dark squared bishop, as far as I can tell, so that after knight e5, putting more pressure on d7 and preventing black from castling because it would leave the d7 bishop without adequate defense. Can you see my cat Honey here? Hi, Honey. After queen e7, white can trade on d7, and we have a Paul Morphy opera house-esque type of position in which black has a really hard time unwinding because his knight on d7 is so bad and pinned. And it's here that white can play queen to d4. And the only reason he can play queen to d4 here is that earlier move b4 distracted black's dark squared bishop. And the idea is the g7 pawn's under attack, black can't castle to get out of it. This is just a serious bind. White may be putting a rook on the d-file soon. There's even a line in which, let me show you, the queen goes to c7 instead, and then knight d7, knight d7. White plays this move bishop f4, distracting the black queen so that he can take on d7 with check. Lots of crazy tactics, and this is what you tend to see from a computer when one player has more space than the other and the position opens up, and one player's king is safe and the other one's not. But I find these tactics very difficult to find in an actual game. I think if I can ever get better at that, I'll be a significantly better player. All right, I played b3, Donna castled, bishop b2. My idea with b3 was just to solidify the pawn on c4, so there's no more d takes c4 resulting in my bishop being displaced and black expanding on the queen side. And so white retains the most advanced part of his pawn structure. She played b6 with the idea to develop this light squared bishop in support of these pawns on the long diagonal, and eventually to play c5. Rook c1, bishop b7, and c takes d5. Okay, I didn't play c takes d5 earlier because I thought black would like to take back with the e-pawn, freeing this light squared bishop to do something on this diagonal. But after bishop b7, I thought the bishop's not on that diagonal anymore, so it's not a big deal. C takes d5. And now the idea is, if black plays e takes d5, well, the bishop's no longer on c8 to benefit from that, and this pawn on c6 may become a target. In fact, black may end up having to move it to c5, at which point white can trade it off, and black will end up with this, both players will end up with a structure known as a hanging pawns structure. But Donna played knight takes d5. Oh, and if c takes d5, I think I was just planning on putting the knight on b5. Let's see, knight b5, the bishop goes somewhere. Yeah, and the problem is the bishop has to keep guarding c7, or there might be problems. The rook or the knight could show up there. So let's just say bishop b8. I don't know if that's the move or not. But now maybe the dark square bishop for white shows up on the a3 f8 diagonal. So I thought this looked pretty interesting, pretty advantageous for white. Donna chose to play knight takes d5, with the idea, I think, that she has less space, and so she's going to trade a pair of minors. Interestingly, though, black only has less space because of the recapture on d5 with the knight. I played knight e4 because now that white has more space than black, maybe in a more significant way than here, because white now has a pawn on the 4th rank and black doesn't have any pawns on the 4th rank. White doesn't really want to trade minor pieces. White wants black to have to deal with the fact that she's suffering a little bit for space. So knight e4, hitting the undefended bishop on d6, bishop e7, and queen e2. And this is a little counterintuitive, but sometimes I like to trade off a bad bishop for my opponent in order to make a particular target in his camp weaker. So I wanted to trade off these light squared bishops and then go after the c6 pawn. Knight d to f6. Rook fd1. Okay, I often find myself in these positions not really knowing what to do, and when I'm not sure what to do, I just make my pieces better. So now both the white rooks are good. One's on a half-open file looking at a weakness for black, and the other one's behind the most advanced white central pawn. She played rook c8. I like this, developing a rook. And I played a3, again, just a small improving move, taking b4 away from the black knight and the black dark squared bishop. Knight takes e4, trades off a piece, which is usually a good idea when you have less space. Bishop takes e4 and knight f6, hitting that bishop on e4. Bishop back to d3 with the same kind of idea. At some point I might like to trade these light squared bishops. And she put the knight back on d5. Now, of course, I don't really want to play bishop e4 and repeat again, so I have to find some other way to go here. And I think at this point, the worst pieces for white are the knight on f3 and the bishop on b2. And it's not totally clear how to improve this bishop on b2 without playing e4 and d5, which I think during the game I didn't think I was ready for. I've got too many lines here, but basically there are a lot of positions in which if white plays e4, black's just going to play knight f4. And that's not very good for white. Black will just grab this bishop on d3. So I can't really improve the dark squared bishop right now, and for that reason I improved the knight, knight e5. And the nice thing about this is that even though black can technically kick the knight away, it's not a good idea because the knight will go to g6 and black will have problems. So this is sort of a de facto outpost for white. Bishop to d6 from Donna, and knight c4. Yeah, I mean, this is currently a weakness for black, and if I let black take on e5, my bishop doesn't really wake up, but black gets the ability to play c5, turning this c-pawn from a weakness into a strength. I didn't want that to happen, so I didn't want there to be a capture on e5. Knight c4, bishop b8, and bishop back to e4. Now that the c3 knight is no longer on f3, if she plays knight f6, I can just retreat my bishop to f3, keeping it on the same diagonal as this b7 bishop and as this weakness on c6. f5, okay. During the game and afterwards, because I mentioned this to her after the game, I thought queen h4 just won the game on the spot. Because there's a double attack on h2, and the queen is attacking the undefended bishop on e4. And in fact, why I made this move bishop e4 is that I saw those tactics, but I saw a different version of them. I was looking at, what was it? I was looking at bishop h2 check, king h2, queen h4 check, king g1, and queen takes e4. And then I saw the move knight d6, and I thought, okay, so actually this works out fine for white. So I went ahead and played bishop e4, and then was shocked to realize that black can play queen h4 first with a double attack on h2 and e4. But as it turns out, and I was wrong about this when Donna and I were talking about it, white can play f4, and that protects the bishop on e4 and the h2 square. Okay, so bishop e4 barely works out. She played f5, a move I didn't like during the game, and which I expected to name as maybe the worst black move of the game or something like that, but it comes computer recommended, so I'm not sure what to say. Bishop f3. I guess I just have bias against the movement of the f-pawn. Certainly when black's not ready to play e5 yet, it looks bad because this pawn on e6 becomes a weakness, and the light squares on the king side get weaker. I don't know, but the computer likes it, so whatever. Bishop to f3, queen h4, hitting h2, g3, solidifying things on the king side and giving the light squared bishop the g2 square. Queen to g5, bishop g2. If I don't play bishop g2, there might be some tactic involving f4, e takes f4, and knight takes f4, because the g-pawn is pinned to the king. So bishop g2, h5 from Donna, knight to d2. Yeah, and I just want to reroute this knight to f3 now that the bishop's not on that square anymore. g6. So she's pretty solid over here, but you'll notice that there's a lot of empty space appearing around the black king. And what that means is that if the center of the board ever opens up, that king's probably going to be in trouble. Knight f3, queen e7, and h4. And now I can use g5 as an outpost, and it's going to be hard for black to ever play that move to continue with any kind of a kingside pawn storm. Bishop d6. Alright, and things are getting a little bit critical here because black is threatening to take this a3 pawn, and prior to her playing this move I hadn't even seen that she could threaten this. So I have to play kind of energetically here. I played knight g5, which I wanted to play anyway. And now the idea is that if bishop takes a3, bishop takes a3, queen takes a3, there's knight takes e6. And I think it's pretty clear that this e6 pawn is at least as important as the a and b pawns combined because of the danger the black king is in potentially. So instead she played rook fe8, and now her idea is she can take on a3, and if I do that same, if I trade bishops on a3, I can't actually take on e6 because it's guarded by the rook on e8. But now I can play e4. Yeah, and again, since black advanced all of these kingside pawns, if I can open up the center of the board, the black king may be in trouble, especially with a really nice knight already posted on g5. Donna played knight c7. If she takes here, there are a few options for a couple of options for white. Either recapture with a diagonally moving piece puts the g6 pawn under serious pressure. Okay, so e4, she played knight c7. This move's a little bit, she'd like, of course, to defend her king with this knight, but that would run into e5, forking the knight and the bishop. And the knight has nowhere else to go, so it has to go back to c7. But now this bishop is kind of short on squares. So I played b4, and the idea is I'm protecting my a3 pawn, or at least that's what it looks like. But the real threat is to grab this bishop on d6. So if black plays a5 here, e5 wins a piece. Donna saw that and played knight a6, creating some escape squares for the bishop on d6. And here I just calculated a tactical sequence that I thought would give me a significant advantage. E takes f5 opens the center, so it's strategically correct, but you just have to make sure that the tactics work out. If g takes f5, then queen takes h5, grabs a pawn, and puts the black king in serious trouble, I think. So she had to play e takes f5, but this allows queen c4 check. And now that this bishop is off of, well, I guess it wouldn't be doing anything here anyway. Yeah, it would. Pardon me. If the light squared bishop could move to e6, black could defend against this check, but that bishop is kind of off on the queen side, as is the knight, and so neither one is doing very much to defend the black king. If the black king moves to a dark square, d5 will come with check, and that looks like a disaster. D takes c6, and b5 will establish... Can I do that immediately? Yeah. Or... I don't know. But anyway, there's... Yeah, because my bishop on g2 is guarding c6. So I can play d5, d takes c6. I wouldn't be able to take the bishop on b7 probably because my queen is lined up with a black rook on the c-file, but I could just play b5 and have a protected passed pawn on c6, and that should be winning for white. So she has to play king to f8. And yeah, this is, in my calculation, I got as far as rook e1, which threatens the black queen. And if the queen moves away, knight e6 check looks pretty deadly, because the black king is going to have to move to a square which allows a revealed check, either from the rook on e1 or the queen on c4. So black kind of has to play queen takes e1 here, rook takes e1, rook takes e1. And I got here in my calculation, realized white was threatening queen f7 checkmate, and that the only way for black to defend against that is rook e7, because if rook c7, knight e6 check grabs that rook, or forces black to take on e6 with the rook. So black has to play rook e7, and I thought with white to move, and white having a queen, and black's king being exposed, and white still having two bishops, and a nice knight on g5, this should be winning somehow. So I got here and had to calculate, and what I came up with was knight e6 check. And again, here, if the black king goes to a light square, there's going to be a revealed check, which will at least grab a piece on a6. So her only move is king e8, but now I have d5. And after c takes d5, queen b5 check, king f7, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now an important move here, because if I play queen takes d5, then after rook takes e6, queen b7 check, rook c7, protecting the rook, I can take a piece back on a6, but it was kind of an irrelevant piece. The knight on a6 wasn't doing much. And black might have some counterplay here. The king actually looks reasonably safe. Well, maybe not. I mean, let's go to that again. If my queen could find her way to a dark square on the long diagonal, then she can just invade again with the bishop and probably win something. So white's probably still winning here. But I thought it would be better, after bishop takes d5, to throw in the in-between move knight g5 check. Getting the knight out of danger, and preventing the black king from moving to e6, so she has to move somewhere else. She moved back to f8, and now I can take the bishop on d5 without allowing rook takes e6. She played rook d8, but this allows knight e6 check, grabbing an exchange, and so now I think white is clearly winning, hitting this pawn on g6, and that pawn turns out to be indefensible because the bishop is guarding the only non-queen guarded square from which the black king can defend it. Knight c7, whoopsie daisy. Rook e6, queen e6, knight c7, queen takes g6, and the black king side's falling apart. Rook d7, queen takes h5, rook f7, so she defends one of her pawns, but white now has a passed pawn on the h-file. And combining the pushing of that pawn with an attack on the black king and the black pieces should lead to a victory here for white. Queen h6 check forks the bishop on d6 and the king on f8, so she has to play king e7, and then queen g5 check gets the queen out of the way of the h-pawn with tempo. King d7, And with her king on d7, I decided to play queen g6, hitting this undefended rook on f7, so she comes back with the king to defend it. But that causes the queen now to guard one of the important squares near where the h-pawn is going to queen. h5, knight e6, h6, knight f8. That's okay, the queen can get out of the way with tempo. Queen g5 check, king e8, bishop g7. So now the rook can no longer defend h7. And what is white threatening here? Yeah, I mean, white is... I guess white's just threatening to take the knight on f8, followed by just putting the queen on g6 and playing h7, h8, I guess. Okay, knight e6 forks the queen and bishop, but I played queen g6, pinning the rook, and she resigned here. There's not much for black to do. If knight takes g7, then h takes g7 makes a new queen. And there's really nothing else. All right, so those were my 2 games this week. One against a strong Class A player on Wednesday and a strong Class B player on Thursday. And I've got one more game at the Fitchburg Club in this tournament. I'm at 4 out of 4 right now, and the closest other player is at 3 out of 4, which means I can't do worse than a tie for first. But every game I play there risks a lot of rating points because I outrate most of the players there by at least 200 points. So we'll see what happens. I'll still need to win, and I'll hopefully bring you that game next week, as well as the second round game from the Worcester tournament. All right, thank you.